Good morning. It is Wednesday, March the 16th, and this is The Drill. Welcome to all the butchers, bakers, and candlestick makers out there. This is Ron, your host and the only true conservative in the United States today. So today, after the Daily Declaration for Spiritual Warfare and the Pledge of Allegiance and the Star-Spangled Banner, we will have no free lunch and the Great Reset. All that when I come back. Thank you. And now the Daily Declaration for Spiritual Warfare for March the 16th. I will cover you in the garment of righteousness. You are my beloved child. I have clothed you with garments of salvation and arrayed you in a robe of righteousness. My Holy Spirit has clothed you with power from on high, and you are clothed with my Son, Christ. I have given you my beauty for your ashes, the oil of my joy for your mourning, and my garment of praise for your spirit of heaviness. My righteousness is a breastplate of protection for you, and I have shod your feet with the gospel of my peace. I have made you my ambassador so that you may speak boldly to explain the mysteries of my gospel. Isaiah chapter 61, verse 10, Ezekiel chapter 16, verses 8 through 13, Galatians chapter 3, verse 27, and Ephesians chapter 6, verse 14. Prayer declaration. I am clothed with the garment of salvation. My God has placed the robe of his righteousness over me and given me the garment of praise for the spirit of heaviness. He has prepared me for battle by preparing me with armor of defense. His righteousness is my strong and impenetrable breastplate, and his justice protects me like armor. And that was the Daily Declaration for Spiritual Warfare for March the 16th. Thank you. Who is the true conservative? He is religious and realistic. He is the person that understands that culture is the foundation for politics. He acknowledges a benevolent universe. He is patriotic and uses common sense. He makes judgments, refuses to speculate, speaks clearly and definitively, and is not afraid to say no. He's open-minded, asking why rather than why not. He is consistent, credible, and influential, not ashamed of his existence, unafraid to learn or correct his mistakes. He is a normal American. Thank you, thank you. What are the tactics in support of the strategy to rid America of socialist influence? The long-term tactics are to be a true conservative, talk like a conservative, act like a conservative, dress like a conservative, and think like a conservative. The short-term tactics are rhetorical. True conservatives need to win all of the arguments. That means don't prove a negative. Don't take their word for it. Don't be neutral, and ask plenty of questions. Thank you, thank you. What is the true conservative strategy for defeating socialists in this country? Socialists must be driven from positions of power, and since it is lefty counterculture that provides the foundation for their political success, true conservatives must resist left-wing counterculture and promote normal American culture. By changing our culture, we will change our politics. And by changing the culture, we mean you need to get married, have a family, and raise your children. Thank you, thank you. What are the true conservative political priorities? Number 1, the abolition of abortion throughout the land. Number 2, to make nuclear, chemical, and biological weapons obsolete. Number 3, the immediate decertification of all public employee unions. Number 4, the immediate assignment of criminal and civil liabilities to all government regulators. Number 5, the immediate repeal of the so-called Patriot Act. Number 6, the immediate repeal of all so-called emergency dictator laws. Thank you, thank you. And now, there's no free lunch. The most basic question is not what is best, but who shall decide what is best? Thomas Sowell. This is indeed the question. Defenders of free enterprise do not believe in a perfect administration under a market economy. Rather, we do not believe in the possibility of such. To the extent imperfect decision-making is accepted, we then seek to solve for who has the best chance of answering the question correctly. He with local knowledge or he without? He who will reap the consequences of his decision or he who will not? Better decisions that are imperfect are superior to worse ones that are also imperfect. And accountability where a decision is made is better than no accountability where a decision is also made. One simply must abandon belief in the omnipotent, disinterested third party, which no one explicitly believes in, but too many implicitly do. Once we have accepted the inevitability of imperfect decision-making, choosing who decides is the easy part. And that was, there's no free lunch. Thank you. And now, what is the Great Reset? It's an article adapted from a talk delivered at Hillsdale College on November 7th, 2021, during a Center for Constructive Alternatives conference on the Great Reset. And it's an article in the December 2021 issue of Imprimis, a publication of Hillsdale College. And it's written by Michael Rechtenwald. More on him later. So, right now it is the Great Reset a conspiracy theory imagining a vast left-wing plot to establish a totalitarian one-world government? No. Despite the fact that some people will have spun conspiracy theories based on it, with some reason, as we will see, the Great Reset is real. Indeed, just last year, Klaus Schwab, founder and executive chairman of the World Economic Forum, a famous organization made up of the world's political, economic, and cultural elites that meets annually in Davos, Switzerland, and Terry Malloret, a co-founder and main author of the Monthly Barometer, published a book called COVID-19, The Great Reset. In the book, they define the Great Reset as a means of addressing the weaknesses of capitalism that were purportedly exposed by the COVID pandemic. But the idea of the Great Reset goes back much further. It can be traced at least as far back as the inception of the WEF, originally founded as the European Management Forum. In 1971, in that same year, Schwab, an engineer and an economist by training, published his first book, Modern Enterprise Management in Mechanical Engineering. It was in this book that Schwab first introduced the concept he would later call stakeholder capitalism, arguing that the management of a modern enterprise must serve not only shareholders, but all stakeholders to achieve long-term growth and prosperity. Schwab and the WEF have promoted the idea of stakeholder capitalism ever since. They can take credit for the stakeholder and public-private partnership rhetoric and policies embraced by governments, corporations, non-governmental organizations, and international governance bodies worldwide. The specific phrase Great Reset came into general circulation over a decade ago with the publication of a 2010 book, The Great Reset, by American urban studies scholar Richard Florida. Written in the aftermath of the 2008 financial crisis, Florida's book argued that the 2008 economic crash was the latest in a series of great resets, including the long depression of the 1870s and the Great Depression of the 1930s, which he defined as periods of paradigm-shifting systemic innovation. 4 years after Florida's book was published, at the 2014 annual meeting of the WEF, Schwab declared, "What we want to do in Davos this year is to push the reset button," and subsequently the image of a reset button would appear on the WEF's website. Back in a minute. Thank you. In 2018 and 2019, the WEF organized two events that became the primary inspiration for the current Great Reset project, and also, for obvious reasons, fresh fodder for conspiracy theorists. In May 2018, the WEF collaborated with the Johns Hopkins Center for Health Security to conduct CLADE-X, C-L-A-D-E-X, a simulation of a national pandemic response. And specifically, the exercise simulated the outbreak of a novel strain of a human parainfluenza virus with genetic elements of the Nipah virus called CLADE-X. Simulation ended with a news report stating that in the face of CLADE-X, without effective vaccines, experts tell us that we could eventually see 30 to 40 million deaths in the U.S. and more than 900 million around the world, 12% of the global population. Clearly, preparation for a global pandemic was in order. In October 2019, the WEF collaborated with Johns Hopkins and Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation on another pandemic exercise, Event 201, which simulated an international response to the outbreak of a novel coronavirus. This was 2 months before COVID outbreak in China became news and 5 months before the World Health Organization declared it a pandemic, and it closely resembled the future COVID scenario, including incorporating the idea of asymptomatic spread. The CLADE-X and Event 201 simulations anticipated almost every eventuality of the actual COVID crisis, most notably the responses by governments, health agencies, the media, tech companies, and elements of the public. The responses and their effects included worldwide lockdowns, the collapse of businesses and industries, the adoption of biometric surveillance technologies, and emphasis on social media censorship to combat quote, misinformation, unquote, the flooding of social and legacy media with authoritative sources, widespread riots, and mass unemployment. In addition to being promoted as a response to COVID, the Great Reset is promoted as a response to climate change. In 2017, the WEF published a paper titled, "We Need to Reset the Global Operating System to Achieve the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals." On June 13, 2019, the WEF signed a Memorandum of Understanding with the United Nations to form a partnership to advance the UN 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. Shortly after that, the WEF published the United Nations World Economic Forum Strategic Partnership Framework for the 2030 Agenda, promising to help finance the UN's climate change agenda and committing the WEF to help the UN meet the needs of the fourth industrial revolution, including providing assets and expertise for digital governance. Back in a minute. Thank you, thank you. In June 2020, at its 50th annual meeting, the WEF announced the Great Reset's official launch. And a month later, Schwab and Malleret published their book on COVID and the Great Reset. The book declared that COVID represents an opportunity that can be seized, that we should take advantage of this unprecedented opportunity to reimagine our world, that the moment must be seized to take advantage of this unique window of opportunity, and that for those fortunate enough to find themselves in industries naturally resilient to the pandemic, think here of big tech companies like Apple, Google, Facebook, and Amazon, the crisis was not only more bearable, but even a source of profitable opportunities at a time of distress for the majority. The Great Reset aims to usher in a bewildering economic amalgam. Schwab's stakeholder capitalism, which I've called corporate socialism, and Italian philosopher Giorgio Agamben's has called communist capitalism. In brief, stakeholder capitalism involves the behavioral modification of corporations to benefit not shareholders, but stakeholders, individuals and groups that stand to benefit or lose from corporate behavior. Stakeholder capitalism requires not only corporate responses to pandemics and ecological issues such as climate change, but also rethinking corporations' commitments to already vulnerable communities within their ecosystems. This is the social justice aspect of the Great Reset. To comply with that, governments, banks, and asset managers use the Environmental, Social, and Governance Index to squeeze non-woke corporations and businesses out of the market. The ESG index is essentially a social credit score that is used to drive ownership and control of production away from the non-woke or non-compliant. One of the WF's many powerful strategic partners, BlackRock Incorporated, the world's largest asset manager, is solidly behind the stakeholder model. In a 2021 letter to the CEOs, BlackRock CEO Larry Fink declared that climate risk is investment risk, and the creation of a sustainable index investments has enabled a massive acceleration of capital towards companies better prepared to address climate risks. The COVID pandemic, Fink wrote, accelerated the flow of funds towards sustainable investments. We have long believed that our clients, as shareholders in your company, will benefit if you can create enduring, sustainable value for all of your stakeholders. As more and more investors choose to tilt their investments towards sustainability-focused companies, the tectonic shift we are seeing will accelerate further. And because this will have such a dramatic impact on how capital is allocated, every management team and board will need to consider how this will impact their company's stock. Fink's letter is more than a report to CEOs. It is an implicit threat. Be woke or else. Back in a minute. Thank you. In their recent book on the Great Reset, Schwab and Malleret pit stakeholder capitalism against neoliberalism, defining the latter as a corpus of ideas and policies favoring competition over solidarity, creative destruction over government intervention, and economic growth over social welfare. In other words, neoliberalism refers to the free enterprise system. In opposing that system, stakeholder capitalism entails corporate cooperation with the state and vastly increased government intervention in the economy. Proponents of the Great Reset hold neoliberalism responsible for our economic woes. But in truth, the governmental favoring of industries and players within industries, what used to be known as corporatism or economic fascism, has been the real source of what Schwab and his allies at the WEF decry. While approved corporations are not necessarily monopolies, the tendency of the Great Reset is toward monopolization, vesting as much control over production and distribution in as few favored corporations as possible, while eliminating industries and producers deemed non-essential or inimical. To bring this reset about, Schwab writes, every country from the United States to China must participate, and every industry from oil and gas to tech must be transformed. Another way of describing the goal of the Great Reset is capitalism with Chinese characteristics, a two-tiered economy with profitable monopolies at the state and the state on top, and socialism for the majority below. Several decades ago, as China's growing reliance on the for-profit sector of its economy could no longer be credibly denied by the Chinese Communist Party, its leadership approved the slogan, "Socialism with Chinese characteristics," to describe its economic system. Formulated by Deng Xiaoping, the phrase was meant to rationalize the CCP's allowance of for-profit development under a socialist political system. The CCP considered the privatization of the Chinese economy to be a temporary phase, lasting as long as 100 years if necessary, on the way to a communist society. Party leaders maintain that this approach has been necessary in China because socialism was introduced too early there, when China was a backward agrarian country. China needed a capitalist booster shot. Stripped of its socialist ideological pretensions, the Chinese system amounts to a socialist or communist state increasingly funded by capitalist economic development. The difference between the former Soviet Union and contemporary China is that when it became obvious that a socialist economy had failed, the former gave up its socialist economic pretenses, while the latter has not. Back in a minute. Thank you. The Great Reset represents the development of the Chinese system in the West, but in reverse. Whereas the Chinese political class began with a socialist political system and then introduced privately held for-profit production, the West began with capitalism and is now implementing a Chinese-style political system. This Chinese-style system includes vastly increased state intervention in the economy on the one hand, and on the other, the kind of authoritarian measures that the Chinese government uses to control its population. Schwab and Malaret write that if the past 5 centuries in Europe and America have taught us anything, it is that acute crises contribute to boosting the power of the state. It's always been the case, and there is no reason that it should be different with the COVID-19 pandemic. The draconian lockdown measures employed by Western governments managed to accomplish goals of which corporate socialists and the WEF could only dream. Above all, the destruction of small businesses, eliminating competitors for corporate monopolists favored by the state. In the U.S. alone, according to the Foundation for Economic Education, millions of small businesses closed their doors due to the lockdown. Yelp data indicates that 60% of these closures are now permanent. Meanwhile, companies like Amazon, Apple, Facebook, and Google enjoyed record gains. Other developments that advanced the Great Reset agenda have included unfettered immigration, travel restrictions for otherwise legal border crossing, the Federal Reserve's unrestrained printing of money, and the subsequent inflation, increased taxation, increased dependence on the state, broken supply chains, the restriction and job losses due to vaccine mandates, and the prospect of personal carbon allowances. Such policies reflect the fairness aspect of the Great Reset. Fairness requires lowering the economic status of people in wealthier nations like the U.S. relative to that of people in poorer regions of the world. One of the functions of woke ideology is to make the majority in developed countries feel guilty about their wealth, which the elites aim to reset downwards, except, one notices, for the elites themselves, who need to be rich in order to fly in their private jets to Davos each year. Back in a minute. Thank you. The Great Reset's corporate stakeholder model overlaps with its governance and geopolitical model. States and favored corporations are combined in public-private partnerships and together have control of governance. The corporate-state hybrid is largely unaccountable to the constituents of national governments. Governance is not only increasingly privatized, but also, and more importantly, corporations are deputized as major additions to governments and intergovernmental bodies. The state is thereby extended, enhanced, and augmented by the addition of enormous corporate assets. As such, corporations have become what I have called governmentalities. Otherwise, private organizations wielded as state apparatuses with no obligations to answer to pesky voters. Since these corporations are multinational, the state essentially becomes globalist, whether or not one world government is ever formalized. As if the economic and governmental resets were not dramatic enough, the technological resets reads like a dystopian science fiction novel. It is based on the Fourth Industrial Revolution, or 4IR for short. The first, second, and third industrial revolutions were the mechanical, electrical, and digital revolutions. The 4IR marks the convergence of existing and emerging fields, including big data, artificial intelligence, machine learning, quantum computing, genetics, nanotechnology, and robotics. The foreseen result will be the merging of the physical, digital, and biological worlds, which presents a challenge to the ontologies by which we understand ourselves in the world, including the definition of a human being. There's nothing original about this. Transhumanists and singularitarians, prophets of technological singularity, such as Ray Kurzweil, forecasted these and other revolutionary developments long ago. What's different about the globalist version of 4IR is the attempt to harness it to the ends of the Great Reset. If already existing 4IR developments are any indication of the future, then the claim that it will contribute to humans' happiness is false. These developments include internet algorithms that feed users prescribed news and advertisements and downrank or exclude banned content, algorithms that censor social media content and consign dangerous individuals and organizations to digital gulags, keyword warrants based on search engine inputs, apps that track and trace COVID violations, and report offenders to the police, robot police with scanners to identify and round up the unvaccinated and other dissidents, and smart cities where residents are digital entities to be monitored, surveilled, and recorded, and where data on their every move is collected, collated, stored, and attached to a digital identity and a social credit score. Back in a minute. Thank you. In short, 4IR technologies subject human beings to kind of technological management that makes surveillance by the NSA look like child's play. Schwab goes so far as to cheer developments that aim to connect human brains directly to the cloud for the sake of data mining our thoughts and memories. If successful, this would constitute a technological mastery over decision-making that would threaten human autonomy and undermine free will. The 4IR seeks to accelerate the merging of humans and machines, resulting in a world in which all information, including genetic information, is shared, and every action, thought, and motivation is known, predicted, and possibly precluded. Unless taken out of the hands of corporate socialist technocrats, the 4IR will eventually lead to a virtual and inescapable prison of body and mind. In terms of the social order, the Great Reset promises inclusion in a shared destiny, but the subordination of so-called netizens implies economic and political disenfranchisement, a hypervigilance over self and others, and social isolation, or what Hannah Arendt called organized loneliness. On a global scale, this organized loneliness is already manifest in lockdowns, masking, social distancing, and the social exclusion of the unvaccinated. The title of the Ad Council's March 2020 public service announcement, Alone Together, perfectly captures this sense of organized loneliness. In my recent book, Gulag Archipelago, I agreed that leftist authoritarianism is the political ideology and modus operandi of what I call big digital, which is on the leading edge of a nascent world system. Big digital is the communications, ideological, and technological arm of an emerging corporate socialist totalitarianism. The Great Reset is the name that has since been given to the project of establishing this world system. Just as Schwab and the WEF predicted, the COVID crisis has accelerated the Great Reset. Monopolistic corporations have consolidated their grip on the economy from above, while socialism continues to advance for the rest of us below. In partnership with big digital, big pharma, the mainstream media, national and international health agencies, and compliant populations, hitherto democratic Western states, think especially of Australia, New Zealand, and Austria, are being transformed into totalitarian regimes modeled after China. But let me end on a note of hope, because the goals of the Great Reset depend on the obliteration not only of free markets, but of individual liberty and free will. It is, perhaps, ironically, unsustainable. Like earlier attempts at totalitarianism, the Great Reset is doomed to ultimate failure. That doesn't mean, however, that it won't, again, like those earlier attempts, leave a lot of destruction in its wake, which is all the more reason to oppose it now and with all our might. And that was The Great Reset, and it was an article by Michael Rechtenwald in the December 2021 issue of Imprimis, a publication of Hillsdale College. Michael Rechtenwald is the Chief Academic Officer for American Scholars. He has a BA from the University of Pittsburgh, an MA from Case Western Reserve University, and a PhD in Literary and Cultural Studies from Carnegie Mellon University. He is taught at New York University, Duke University, North Carolina Central University, Carnegie Mellon University, and Case Western Reserve University. He is the author of numerous books, including 19th Century British Secularism, Science, Religion, and Literature, Google Archipelago Beyond Woke, and Thought Criminal. One of the things that I wanted to call note to, let's see, was it here? I don't think so. Let's see. COVID-19 pandemic, draconian. Western governments would only dream. I think it's actually in here. Merging of humans and machines in a world which all information. That's not it. Feed users prescribed news. Key warrant-based searches. If the first, second, or third industrial revolutions were mechanical, electro, and digital, that's convergent. Large management, surveillance. NSA look like child's play. Schwab. Let's see. No, that's not what I'm looking for. Seeks to accelerate. Let's see. Well, one of the things let's go to this one that I wanted to talk about is, he says, but let me end on a note of hope. Because the goals of the Great Reset depend on the obliteration not only of free markets but of individual liberty and free will, it is, perhaps ironically, unsustainable. Like earlier attempts at totalitarianism, the Great Reset is doomed to failure, but it's going to leave a lot of destruction in its wake. And I've said that many times, that that's the reason that we try to destroy socialism in this country. It's ultimately going to kill itself, okay? Because all of these ideas, these perfectionistic ideas, because that's what this is for IR, the Great Reset, all that is to try to create the perfect society. And there is no perfect society. So you end up with these totalitarian monster states that are just absolutely cruel and destructive, and eventually they destroy themselves. The Soviet Union did. Venezuela is in the process of destroying itself. The only reason that communist China is still around is because, as they said in this article, the communist Chinese, as a matter of fact, that's the other part of this that I was looking for, but the communist Chinese learned a lesson from the destruction of the Soviet Union. They saw that if we just hang on to communism, with a death grip, and we're just absolutely dedicated to communism, we're going the same way as the Soviet Union. We're going to end up nowhere. We're going to have no influence, out of power, broken up, etc. And so that's where they became. How do you refer to this as? A particular, let's see if we've got it here, well proved. So monopolies, the tendency degrades toward monopolization. Here we go. Proponents of the Great Reset hold neoliberalism responsible for our economic woes, but in truth, the governmental favoring of industries and players within industries used to be known as corporatism or economic fascism. Okay, so that's basically when the Chinese system in the West, what they were talking about was. Here it is. Several decades ago, as Chinese growing reliance on the for-profit sectors of its economy could no longer be credibly denied, they approved the slogan called Socialism with Chinese Characteristics, which is basically, again, economic fascism. You have corporations in China that are allowed to thrive. They're allowed to have private owners, but it is the state that ultimately will tell them what to do, and that these businesses are basically in the business of furthering the aims of the state first and foremost. So that's the one of the watchwords. I've always talked about that too, economic fascism, and that every country in the world seems to be on the track of economic fascism, and including the United States. We have more and more corporations, McDonald's, American Express recently, that is supposed to be as bad as Coca-Cola in terms of social policy, creating some type of social policy, more than likely at the behest of the government. So, and that makes, if the businesses are working hand in hand with the government, it's economic fascism. That's all there is to it. Okay, and what is the solution? And that's the problem with this article, is that it's a little bit doomsdayish in that he doesn't give much, except for at the end. He doesn't give much of an idea of what is it we should do about this? How do we prevent this from happening? He does say that, and he says we need to fight it with all our might. Okay, so what's the first thing to do? I think that in the United States, the best thing to do is what Ayn Rand suggested 50 years ago, where she said there has to be a separation between business and state, that there must be a constitutional amendment there too. Just like we have a separation between church and state, the church doesn't pay taxes, but at the same time, it has no influence on our politics. It doesn't get to go and lobby the government. Corporations should be the same way. No taxes for the corporations, but the corporations have absolutely no influence over our politics. And this is the way we can keep ourselves from becoming, or perhaps I should say, remaining economic fascists. Thank you. Who is the socialist? He is the man that is spiritual. He's the man that seeks consensus. He's subjective, petty, and small, taking everything in life personally. He's outrageous, boring, and rude. He pretends to be a leader and a change agent. He pretends that he's your friend. He is sly, cunning, and deceptive. He dresses, acts, and speaks like a slob. He is informal and terminally unique. He is childish and pretends that he knows nothing. He has no conscience and pretends that might makes right and that the ends justify the means. He is impulsive and rationalizes his behavior. He is deterministic, blaming others for his mistakes. He is skeptical, demanding that others solve his problems. His unreasonableness and irresponsibility make him a bad role model, bad father, brother, family member, friend, and a bad person, period. So if you think that you can be friends with a socialist, think again. Thank you. This is Ron, your host, the only true conservative in the United States today, bidding adios to all the butchers, bakers, and candlestick makers out there, and reminding you to tune in to the John and Ken Show, which is an excellent example of how true conservatives communicate. It's a radio show that's on KFI AM 640 from 2 o'clock in the afternoon to 6 o'clock in the evening, Monday through Friday. And that's Pacific time. So that's an excellent show to listen to. And other than that, until next time, remember to be honest, to be smart, to be beautiful, and to remember that the left has no authority, no power, and they can't win.